So the second point is the desperation of the father. Look at verses 20 through 24 with me. So they brought the boy to Jesus. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for him who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." So they bring the boy to Jesus after Jesus asks for them to bring him. And as soon as the demon sees Jesus, he goes nuts. Uh, does what he does with the boy normally. He throws the boy on the ground. The kid's rolling around. He's seizing up. He's foaming at the mouth. It's a crazy situation. And and Jesus has no urgency about him at all. He and the Father are just kind of standing there and watching this happen. And Jesus asks the Father, "How long has this been going on?" As if Jesus didn't know. I mean, did he not really know? He knew. Remember the rule. Whenever the all-knowing God asks a question, it's not so that he can gain information that he didn't already have. It's for our benefit that he asks us questions. And what Jesus was doing here with this father was he was really kind of augmenting, kind of bringing right up to the surface and putting it in the front of the father's mind that this has been going on a long time and nothing has helped. The teachers of the law couldn't help, his disciples couldn't help. The only person left was Jesus. He was focusing the father's mind on him so that when he walked away with a son who had been delivered, he would never for a moment doubt that it was by the hand of God through Jesus that his son was saved. So now we're going to move into this probably one of the most famous sections in all the gospels, and I want to pull out 3 points. Okay, so the first one is this: the uncertainty with which the father approached Jesus with. If you can do anything. And now notice how he says that. If you can do anything. You see the unbelief or the doubt or the uncertainty that Jesus had the power to do anything. See, we I've used this father oftentimes in my teachings. I've been hard on him because of those words right there. And I've used him as the anti-example for prayer, not to pray like that, not to come to Jesus, you know, hesitant and double-minded. Can you? Are you able? Is it within your power to do something? Nothing like that. We need to come absolutely certain God has the ability to do something. The if is in the matter of his will. If you're willing, I know that you can. Okay? And so I've been hard on this father though, but in the last few days, I've really kind of let his situation just sink in a little bit more. Parents, have you ever had your heart ripped out of your chest while you stood by helplessly, watching your child go through something and you could do nothing about it? This father, how many times has he rescued his son from drowning? How many times, how many burns are on his son's body that he rescued his son from a fire and then had to take care of those burn wounds? Here was a father who never could hear from his own son's voice, "Daddy, I love you," because his son was a mute. Here was a father who could say, "Son, I love you," but his son couldn't hear it. His son couldn't hear his own father's words, his own father's voice. I've lightened up on him a little bit more, and I've come to have a little bit more compassion instead of judgment for his situation. Well, parents, I think that at somewhere in our lives we can relate to this dad, and we felt helpless when it comes to our children. I believe that Jesus did, in fact, have compassion in this moment for the dad. He wouldn't have done the miracle if he didn't. Remember, all of the miracles that Jesus does are coming out of his mercy and his compassion for people. Jesus didn't go around doing some circus act show just to put on a performance in front of people. No, the miracles and the power that he exercised in front of people and for people was to help them when they couldn't help themselves. The second thing we see is not just uh, the uncertainty that the Father approached Jesus with, but the second thing we see is the understanding that Jesus gave to this Father. If you can, he says, all things are possible for him who believes. Now, those are some of the most famous words of Jesus and some of the most cherished words as well, and they ought to be for good reason, okay? What does Jesus mean when he says that everything is possible for those who believe? Does he mean that when somebody believes, they won't catch COVID-19 and they don't need to worry about social distancing? Does he mean that if I believe, my cancer will just miraculously disappear automatically? Does he mean that if I believe, then my daughter will no longer be addicted? Does it mean that if I just believe that my son will no longer have this confusion over his gender identity? Does it mean that if I believe and I pray the Janis Joplin prayer that I'm going to get a Mercedes Benz? What does Jesus mean when he says everything is possible for those who believe? Well, I think the key here is to notice the word possible. Jesus says all things are possible, not guaranteed, not automatic, but all things now become potential when you factor God into the equation. Okay, if you leave God out, if God's not part of it, then we are just left with our own limitations as mankind. But when God is a part of the situation, now all sorts of things become possible that were never possible when it was just us. Think of the Red Sea. The Israelites miraculously were delivered out of slavery in Egypt. That was the first miracle. They never were going to free themselves. It was humanly impossible for the Jews to escape slavery in Egypt. God miraculously delivered them. They came to the Red Sea, and they had the Red Sea against their backs, and they had Pharaoh and the armies barreling down on them. They had nowhere to go. Their backs were up against the wall. Humanly speaking, they were dead meat. But because God was with them and he was part of the situation, something happened that would never have been able to happen by human power. Turn around and look at the Red Sea being parted. You see, what is going on here is that with God, all things become potential. With God, okay, all things become possibilities, but only for those who believe. Those who don't believe forfeit the possibilities that otherwise would be available to them if they but looked to God. Those who do believe have the possibilities opened up to them because God is now going to work on their behalf. Jesus says it this way because here's the thing, not every possibility is going to be granted. Not everything that God can do is God going to do. This really throws us back on that most fundamental principle of what prayer is. Prayer is a persistent, continuous, tenacious, unrelenting appearing before God to present to him what our hearts are yearning for, to keep coming back to him, to vocalize the deepest needs we feel in our soul, and to not quit with him. See, that kind of praying moves prayer away from God, can you do something, to God, I know you can, will you? It moves it away from the kind of prayer that this father prays, God, if you can, please do it, to what the sick man said to Jesus, what the leper said to Jesus. If you are willing, I know you can. That's the ground of prayer right there, the confidence in God's ability. and the tenacity to persuade him on your knees. So my point there is to channel all your prayers to make God willing. Thirdly is that the Father finds himself unable. The Father finds himself unable to believe. Jesus says all things are possible for those who believe. The Father says, I can't believe. I believe, but help my unbelief. He needs help from Jesus. Earlier I mentioned that there were two kinds of unbelief. One is the unbelief of someone who's uninterested in God, and the other is a religious kind of unbelief. In other words, it's unbelief that is masked by religion. Okay? There's a third kind of unbelief, though, and this is what I would call the unbelief of ignorance, or you could call it undeveloped faith. But the unbelief of ignorance or the undeveloped faith is undeveloped faith because it's never had an experience with God to give it something to believe in and to grow. It's faith that is potential, and it just needs God to show that he is God, and belief will spring, and belief will mature and develop and grow. It's not a calculated rejection of Jesus in the face of all the data and all the evidence. It's just the absence of any information about Jesus. And once someone sees him and experiences him, that faith will really take off and emerge. That's what we see going on here. So we have a Father who has his eyes, here's the key, on his Son and not on Jesus. And we understand and we sympathize with him. But Jesus was teaching this Father a very important lesson about faith. Faith always looks to Jesus. It doesn't look to the circumstances. It's not like Peter walking on the water, able to walk on the water because he kept his eyes on the Lord. He took his eyes off the Lord and looked at the storm, and he began to sink. Faith always looks to Jesus. And in the circumstances, faith always looks for Jesus.